For more than 100 years, we may have been telling the wrong story about one of the world's most mysterious civilizations. The people who built the great palaces of Crete were not who many thought they were. If hidden truths in ancient history pull you in, stay with this one, because the deeper we go, the more this old world starts to feel alive again. Picture the island of Crete thousands of years ago, bright seawater, wind moving through olive trees, ships crossing the blue Aegean, and on that island, something stunning appears. Huge palace centers. Colorful wall paintings, elegant pottery, skilled builders. A writing system no one has fully read even now. Bowls in motion, dancers in motion. A world full of beauty, power, and symbols we still do not fully understand. These were the Minoans. For a long time, their story came wrapped in mystery. And mystery has a way of attracting bold guesses. Early archaeologists looked at Minoan art and objects and saw hints that reminded them of Egypt, Libya, and other places to the south and east. The Minoans seemed so advanced, so refined, so unlike what many expected from an island culture in Bronze Age Europe, that some people began to imagine they must have come from somewhere else, somewhere more ancient, somewhere more civilized, in the old thinking of that time. That idea grew roots. One of the most famous figures in this story was Arthur Evans, the British archaeologist who uncovered Knossos in the early 1900s. He gave the civilization its name, linking it to the legend of King Minos. He also helped to shape the image that much of the modern world would carry, that the Minoans might have had origins outside the Aegean, perhaps from North Africa or another powerful older culture. It sounded exciting. It sounded dramatic. It also fit a pattern people often fall into. When they see something remarkable, they assume it must have come from somewhere far away. But what if the truth was quieter than that, and deeper? What if the Minoans did not arrive as mysterious outsiders stepping onto Crete from a grand lost land? What if they were already part of the story of the Aegean from much earlier than people imagined? That is where the mystery begins to shift, because the old story was built mostly from what people could see. Art, pottery, architecture, symbols, similar shapes, similar colors, similar ideas. And yes, those things matter. Cultures trade, people borrow, ideas travel across seas faster than bloodlines do. A design on a wall can cross an ocean without a people crossing with it. A style can spread without replacing the people who adopt it. That difference matters more than ever now. For years, the Minoans seem to sit inside a fog. Their writing, called Linear A, remains undeciphered. We can look at their signs, but we cannot yet hear their full voice. We know what they made, but not all that they said. And when a civilization cannot fully speak for itself, later generations often speak for it, sometimes too confidently. Then science entered the conversation in a new way. DNA began to speak, and when it did not just tweak the old story, it shook it. In 2013, researchers studied mitochondrial DNA from ancient Minoan skeletal remains from Crete. Mitochondrial DNA follows the maternal line, passed from mothers to children. That study found something powerful. The Minoans did not appear closely tied to Egyptian, Libyan, or other North African populations in the way older theories had suggested. In fact, the study reported that they were only distantly related to those groups. Instead, the evidence suggested stronger links to early Neolithic people and to European populations. The researchers said the Minoans likely arose from a population that had already been in Crete for a very long time, going back to the first farmers who reached the island thousands of years earlier. That was already a major crack in the old picture. Not travelers from a dramatic foreign court, not a transplanted colony from North Africa, not strangers who suddenly appeared and built a civilization out of nowhere, but people with deep roots. And yet, that was only the beginning, because one big question still hung in the air. If the Minoans were local, how local were they? Who exactly were their ancestors? How did they relate to the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece, the people who came later and whose script, Linear B, represents an early form of Greek? Were the two civilizations separate worlds, cousins, rivals? One descended from the other? And what about later Greeks? Was there any real link across all those centuries, or had everything changed? If this mystery is opening up in your mind, write the word roots in the comments, because that single word may hold the heart of this entire story. In 2017, a larger ancient DNA study pushed the door wider open. Researchers analyzed genome-wide data from ancient individuals that included Minoans from Crete, Mycenaeans from mainland Greece, a Neolithic individual from mainland Greece, and Bronze Age people from southwestern Anatolia. They also compared those ancient people with thousands of other ancient and modern individuals. The result was one of those moments in history when a familiar picture does not quite survive contact with new evidence. The researchers found that the Minoans and Mycenaeans were genetically very close to each other. That alone matters. These were not two completely separate human worlds, divided by some huge ancestral gap. They were related populations in the Bronze Age Aegean, but there was more. The study said both groups got most of their ancestry from the first Neolithic farmers of western Anatolia and the Aegean. In simple terms, much of their ancestry went back to the early farming populations that had moved into this region long before the height of the Minoan palaces. The paper described both Minoans and Mycenaeans as having at least 3/4 of their ancestry from those early farming groups. That is an enormous clue. It means the Minoans were not some late-arriving elite replacing the people of Crete. Their roots ran into the deep soil of the region. The shining palaces of the Bronze Age were not floating above history like a miracle from nowhere. They were built by people whose story had already been unfolding across the Aegean for thousands of years. But here comes the next twist, and it matters. The researchers also found that both Minoans and Mycenaeans had another ancestry component from farther east, related to populations from the Caucasus and Iran. That means the story was not simple isolation on an island. The Aegean world was connected. Movement had happened. Mixture had happened. The Bronze Age was already full of motion. So the old outsider theory was wrong in one way. But not every old instinct about connection was wrong. The Minoans were not cut off. They were not sealed in glass. They were part of a living network of peoples, seas, and migrations. Their roots were local, but their world was open. And still, the biggest surprise may be this. The Minoans had that eastern ancestry, but they did not show the northern steppe-related ancestry that appeared in the Mycenaeans. That is a small sentence with a giant shadow. Because the Mycenaeans, according to the study, had an extra ancestry layer not seen in the Minoans, connected to northern populations, including steppe-related groups. So now the picture becomes more detailed. Minoans and Mycenaeans were close. They shared deep ancestry from early farmers. They both had an eastern layer. But the Mycenaeans also carried an added northern element that the Minoans on Crete did not. Why? That question opens another door. Did migrations reach mainland Greece more strongly than Crete? Did the sea act like a filter? Did events unfold at different times? Did power, marriage, trade, and movement reshape mainland people in ways the island did not experience in the same way? Researchers still debate the full path of those movements, but the evidence points to something clear. Bronze Age. Greece was not one still picture. It was a changing human landscape. And suddenly the Minoans become even more interesting, not less, because they are no longer mysterious simply because we could not place them. They are mysterious because now we can place them more honestly and the truth is richer. They were deeply Aegean. They were linked to early farmers of western Anatolia and Greece. They also carried ancestry tied to the east, yet they remained distinct from the Mycenaeans in key ways. They were not what older myths wanted them to be, but they were also not simple. They were real, and real history is always more powerful than fantasy. Think about what that means emotionally. For generations, people often told human stories in dramatic shortcuts. This group came from somewhere grand. That group must have arrived from a superior center. This culture appeared too suddenly, so it must have been imported. But real human history is often built differently, not by one magical arrival, not by one pure origin, but by layers, by memory, by migration, by contact, by adaptation, by people living, marrying, building, burying their dead, teaching their children, surviving storms, and carrying old ancestry into new worlds. The Minoans were not a puzzle because they were less human than we imagined. They were a puzzle because they were more human, and we still are not done, because once DNA began reshaping the story of origins, it also started reshaping the story of identity. For a long time, people asked a simple question in a simple way. Who were the Minoans? But maybe the better question is this. Who did the Minoans become? And who became them after they were gone? That matters because the 2017 research also looked at the relationship between these Bronze Age people and modern Greeks. The study suggested that modern Greeks are genetically close to the Mycenaeans, though not identical. Later mixing happened, more migrations happened, more layers were added, but continuity remained. One of the researchers put it beautifully in plain meaning. Greece was not frozen in time. The people of Greece were a work in progress. Layers came in over the ages, but earlier ancestry was not erased. That idea is almost bigger than the Minoans alone, because it tells us something about identity itself. Identity is not a locked box. It is not a clean line. It is not one moment. It is a river. And when we look at ancient people through that lens, they stop becoming symbols and start becoming human again. The Minoans were not a perfect mystery race from nowhere. They were a Bronze Age people shaped by older farmers, later contacts, local growth, and regional movement. Their art was theirs. Their palaces were theirs. Their rituals were theirs. Their language may still be hidden from us, but their ancestry now speaks with more clarity than before. And here is one of the deepest curiosity loops in this whole story. If the Minoans were so rooted in the Aegean, why did their civilization still feel so startling, so sudden, so unlike what came before? That question does not vanish with DNA. In some ways, it becomes even stronger, because ancestry is not destiny. Knowing where a people came from does not fully explain what they created. The same human roots can grow into very different worlds. A people descended largely from early farmers can still build a palace culture that amazes the future. They can still develop art so lively it feels like movement frozen in time. They can still create symbols that haunt us. They can still write words we cannot yet read. DNA can tell us about ancestry. It cannot by itself explain imagination, religion, fear, ambition, beauty, trade, memory, or the dream life of a civilization. So, when we say DNA revealed their true ancestry, that does not mean the whole Minoan mystery is solved. It means the ground under the mystery is finally clearer. If this story changed the way you see the ancient world, send this video to one person who still loves the feeling of old history opening in a completely new way. Now, let's go deeper into the emotional center of this story, because this is where history stops being just information. Imagine living in Bronze Age Crete. You do not know that thousands of years later people will argue about where you came from. You do not know that your bones may one day speak in a laboratory. You do not know that your painted walls, your tools, your cups, your shrines, your scripts, your jewelry, your graves will become clues for strangers in another age. You just live, you farm, you trade, you cross the sea, you pray, you build, you bury your dead. You watch children grow. You fear earthquakes. You hear stories of kings and beasts and gods. You stand inside a palace court as sunlight falls across stone. That is the true weight of this story. Ancient people were not theories. They were people before they were evidence. And for a long time, the Minoans were covered by our need to explain them in neat ways. Maybe too neat. Maybe too romantic. Maybe too influenced by the old habit of seeing greatness and assuming it must have been imported from somewhere else. But the DNA evidence pushes back against that habit. It says, look closer. It says, do not confuse influence with replacement. It says, do not confuse contact with origin. It says, do not assume that a people who made something extraordinary must have been outsiders. That last point matters far beyond Crete. Again and again in history, cultures have been underestimated in their own homelands. People see brilliance and search for foreign authors. Sometimes that search is valid. Human history is full of migration and exchange. But sometimes the search reveals more about our bias than about the past. In the case of the Minoans, the evidence suggests the civilization arose from people already rooted in the region, especially from populations tied to the first farmers of western Anatolia and the Aegean, with added eastern ancestry from farther beyond. That is not a boring answer. It is a breathtaking one. It means civilization on Crete was not borrowed identity. It was growth. It was transformation. It was the flowering of long human continuity under special conditions. And yet, the island was never alone. Crete sat in the middle of moving worlds. Egypt existed to the south, Anatolia to the east, the Greek mainland to the north. Trade winds, ships, metals, ideas, rituals, symbols, and stories moved across water. So the Minoans could be deeply local and widely connected at the same time. Those things are not opposites. In fact, most great civilizations are exactly that, rooted and open, local and connected, themselves, yet in conversation with the world. That balance may be part of what made them so powerful. And then comes the next mystery. If the Minoans and Mycenaeans were so close genetically, why do their cultures still feel so different in mood? Why does Minoan art often seem lighter, more fluid, more full of motion, while Mycenaean culture is often remembered through fortresses, warriors, and later heroic traditions? Part of that may be our own modern reading. Part of it may be real differences in social structure, politics, and symbolism. Part of it may be the different paths their societies took over time. DNA can tell us kinship, not character. Shared ancestry does not create identical civilizations. Two closely related peoples can build very different worlds. That may be one of the most human truths of all. The Minoans and Mycenaeans were close, but not the same. Crete and the mainland were linked, but not mirrors. History gave them common roots, then sent them down different roads. And somewhere in that split, another old assumption falls apart. People often imagine ancient civilizations as fixed blocks. One people, one origin, one identity, one culture, one line forward. But the real past is messier. It breathes, it shifts, it absorbs, it divides, it remembers. That is why the Minoan story is so compelling now. We are not losing mystery because science entered the room. We are gaining a better kind of mystery, a mystery built from evidence rather than fantasy. A mystery that asks not only where the Minoans came from, but how human worlds form at all. Maybe that is why this story feels so personal, because we ask the same questions about ourselves. Where do we come from? How much of us is old? How much is mixed? What do we inherit? What do we create? At what point does ancestry become identity? At what point does identity become culture? And what do we owe to those who came before us, even when we cannot fully hear their language anymore? The Minoans stand at the center of those questions like figures inside a half-lit room. We know more than we did, but we still do not know everything, and the unknown parts still glow. There is still the silence of Linear A. There is still the fall of the palaces. There are still the volcanic shadows of the Bronze Age. There are still debates about how power worked on Crete, how religion shaped daily life, and how outside contact changed over time. There is still the old ache of a civilization that left beauty everywhere and direct explanation almost nowhere. So yes, DNA changed the story, but it did not close the case. It just told us where to stop looking for easy myths. If one line from the story stays with you, let it be this: extraordinary people do not need foreign legends to become extraordinary. The Minoans remind us of that. They remind us that greatness can rise from long local memory, that islands are not isolated from history, but active makers of it, that culture can bloom from rootedness and exchange together, that a civilization can be both ancient in ancestry and astonishing in expression. And maybe most moving of all, they remind us how fragile historical truth can be. For over a century, one strong idea helped shape how millions imagined them. Then a new kind of evidence arrived, and the picture changed. Not because the past changed, but because our access to it changed. That should humble us. Every generation thinks it finally understands the ancient world. Then the earth gives up another bone, another tooth, another grave, another fragment, another sequence of DNA, and the dead revise the living. Pause for a second and think about that. The people of Bronze Age Crete, silent for thousands of years, have still found a way to answer us. Not with full sentences, not with names, not with complete stories, but with enough truth to overturn a century of confident guessing. That is almost haunting. And maybe also beautiful, because in a way the Minoans were never truly gone. They remained in the land, in the bones, in the bloodlines that partly continued, in the memory of Greece, in the myths that survived, and in the buried evidence waiting for the right tools. Somewhere, under modern footsteps, under stones warmed by the same sun, the old world kept it secret until we were finally able to ask better questions. So what is the true ancestry of the Minoans, as the evidence now suggests? Not a simple North African founding story, not a sudden arrival of a mysterious foreign elite, but largely deep ancestry from the first Neolithic farmers of western Anatolia and the Aegean, along with an additional eastern ancestry component linked to populations farther east, related to the Caucasus and Iran. Closely related to the Mycenaeans, yet not identical, part of a long regional story, part of the living, changing human history of the Aegean. That is the answer. But maybe the deeper truth is not just who they were. Maybe it is what their story reveals about us. We are always tempted by the dramatic shortcut, the lost kingdom, the vanished master race, the outsider genius, the clean origin. But real history is rarely clean. Real history is layered, and real people are never only one thing. The Minoans were never what many thought, not because they were less remarkable than the old myth, but because they were more real than the myth ever allowed. And in the end, that may be the most powerful reveal of all. Not that science destroyed the mystery, but that it gave the mystery a human face. So when you think of the Minoans now, do not picture a civilization dropped onto Crete from some distant dramatic source, just because that makes a better old legend. Picture generations of people rooted in the Aegean world, shaped by ancient farmers, touched by wider movements, building something luminous on their island. Picture people who did not need to come from nowhere to become unforgettable. And remember this. Sometimes the greatest secret hidden in the ancient world is not that the truth is stranger than fiction. It is that the truth, once uncovered, makes fiction feel small.